microwave for you or the oil, they annoy you. You add another snick for the wrong reasons. Election years now seeming like full-blown seasons.
Welcome to the 3 Count Library, where we do my very first book review. Today, we're going to do Death of the Territories by Tim Hornbaker. So this is an excellent book. It is a fantastic wrestling history book. And of course, it goes through exactly what it says it's going to go through, which is the Death of the Territory era. So in this book, you're going to learn about the territories. You're going to learn about where they were situated, who was running the joint, were they in the NWA, were they not in the NWA, what led to the downfall of the organizations. Now, it is not in essay format like I'm going to do it here, so I had to go through and piece together. It is told chronologically, so you learn from the foundation of the NWA to when the NWA is no more. So this is a really fun book. The too long didn't listen version is that this book is very good and you should go buy it. So let's go and start looking at some of the territories that I feel like are some of the more interesting ones. I'm going to stay away from the WWF and Jim Crockett Promotions, because Jim Crockett Promotions, for young viewers who are, listeners rather, who are just now getting into this, Jim Crockett Promotions became WCW. And because WWF and WCW are talked about so much, there really is no point for me to go into that. And plus, the WWF we're going to get into that when we do. I'm probably going to end up doing Capital Revolution, which is the book he wrote on Vincent Sr. and Jess McMahon, the father and grandfather of Vince McMahon. So we're probably going to end up going into those at one point in the future. So let's talk about the Death of the Territories. So the first territory I want to discuss is the AWA. And I feel like the AWA, because it was the first territory to spin out of the NWA, is very, very culturally important for the wrestling business, because they didn't immediately do but the NWA was formed, for people who don't know, for the purposes of creating a singular world champion. Before the NWA was formed, just about anybody who called themselves world champion. Then the NWA was formed for the purposes of creating a singular world title. So what you'll constantly see is that other promotions had their own world titles. And those promotions typically were not in the NWA. If you were in the NWA, you had to recognize the NWA World Heavyweight Championship as the only world title. For example, the WWF title, when Bruno Sammartino had it, was considered a world championship because Vince McMahon Sr. was not in the NWA. And then for some unexplained reason, probably just because he was friends with these guys, he decided to rejoin the NWA during the Pedro Morales days. So Pedro Morales was sort of considered a regional champion, even though it was the same belt. And when Vince, of course, left, then it went back to world title status. Of course, that's all unofficial. And, the NWA doesn't have any ability to say who's a world champion and who isn't. But since they controlled a lot of the promotions in the wrestling space, and they controlled a lot of the most famous wrestlers in the wrestling space, they had the sort of authority where they could dictate who was the world champion and who wasn't, who gets to work and who doesn't, and all that kind of stuff, right? Which is not always the most legal things. So there's another Hornbaker book you can read when you want to talk about that. So let's get started talking about the AWA, the American Wrestling Association, founded in 1960 by Vern Gagne and Wally Carbo, and running out of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. Was started in Minnesota in 1960, Wally Carbo and Vern Gagne. So their main markets were Minneapolis and St. Paul, the Twin Cities. In 1969, they tried to branch out west to Los Angeles and ended up kind of failing. Couldn't break through the LA market. But at their height, the AWA still serviced a lot of the states in the United States as far as bringing wrestling to those areas. For instance, they were pretty much the only wrestling promotion in Minnesota, California, Colorado, Utah, Wisconsin, New Mexico, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, and they owned Chicago, which is, of course, the second biggest city in the United States. So that's a huge market. And Chicago was they bought it from Fred Kohler, who was the promoter of Chicago, and he was actually one of the forerunners of having televised wrestling. So the AWA did very well in in the early part of the century, from 1960 till about the 1980s. He was able to do very well. Their biggest event was called Super Sunday, which featured Hulk Hogan versus Nick Bockwinkel. And it had the largest gate in AWA history of $300,000. The finish to the main event was that Hogan won the title, only to be disqualified for an over-the-top rope decision. This is a very controversial decision because Hogan has the title taken away from him. So they started to have, this is one of the reasons Hogan decided to leave. So they started having financial issues with Hulk Hogan. Depending on who you ask about the situation, the be-all, end-all of it was financial. Some people say, well, Vern didn't want to give Hogan the belt. Some people say Hogan, didn't really want the belt, but Vern wanted some of Hogan's money. That sort of thing. But there was a big fallout between Vern Gagne and Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan, of course, jumped ship to the WWF. And that's pretty much leads to the AWA having financial situations. So we started to see that the WWF, after they get Hulk Hogan, they start to invade Minneapolis. And because Hulk Hogan was very well known to that market, it was a little bit easier for the WWF to get in. And they basically start to really dissect, slowly but surely, the AWA. Some of AWA's biggest stars start to leave. And the TV networks that they used to be able to rely on, they can't rely on them anymore. And so things become very dire for the AWA. And so they started looking out for help. And one of the people that they contacted was Memphis, the CWA, which is Jerry Jarrett. So they started looking out to Jerry Jarrett, trying to get some help. And this leads to a series of pay-per-view events that they would try to do. They also looked to help with Jim Crockett Promotions. This would be in 83, 84, 85. So we see Super Clash 85 was a team up with Jim Crockett Promotions, Chicago, Comiskey Park. Almost immediately after this, however, Jim Crockett and Vern Gagne started having financial arguments about what the gate was. It was somewhere between $200,000 to $280,000, but there was a lot of debate, and these two guys were having a very difficult time trying to work together. And so we started seeing that Vern Gagne and the AWA started doing things to try to counter-program. For instance, Vern Gagne wanted to counter-program WrestleMania by doing a live show out of Chicago. He needed to compete on cable with the WWF and with Jim Crockett Promotions. This led to the ESPN deal where they started doing the Showboat shows out of Las Vegas. They had action figures from Renco Toys. And they started really trying to be aggressive. They had this show called Wrestle Rock, which was supposed to be the AWA answer to the rock and wrestling of the 80s. And it was a Metrodome Stadium in Minneapolis, had a $250,000 live gate, $22,000 fans, but they had Waylon Jennings perform. Waylon Jennings. Waylon Jennings, to my knowledge, is a country music singer and was not exactly hip in the mid-1980s. It was a very interesting thing to read that Waylon Jennings was brought in to try to counter-program the big Cyndi Lauper angle that WWF was doing. And it was like, man, this is literally out of touch. When people say that a promoter is out of touch, Vern Gagne defines it. He does a Wrestle Rock show and brings in Waylon Jennings, and it cost him $85,000 in order to bring Waylon Jennings in. So, shortly after the Wrestle Rock fiasco, Wally Carbo, the longtime co-owner of AWA, and Blackjack Lanza, who was an official at the time, they both leave. Blackjack Lanza goes to join the WWF and begins actually actively helping WWF take over AWA TV stations. So the death blow of AWA was that the WWF stole their main arena, which is the St. Paul Civic Center. They had signed them up with an exclusive deal, which means that they could not use their main arena. And it pretty much was all downhill from there. They, of course, tried to go back to Memphis, create a partnership with Jerry Jarrett. Jerry Jarrett actually tried to buy the promotion, and it fell apart because he would not guarantee Greg Gagne a job. So Jerry Jarrett could have owned the AWA if he only would have said he would hire Greg Gagne, but he said no. He said no. So the AWA's only source of revenue at around this point in time was the ESPN deal. And Vern was forced to give up a lot of his major cities: Denver in Colorado, Chicago, Milwaukee, San Francisco. This is 1988 now. They're bleeding from at this point. They do Super Clash 2, which is a co-promotion with Memphis and World Class Championship Wrestling, which is the Von Erichs. Super Clash 2 ended up being an absolute boondoggle. There was a ton of arguments over the finishes. Only 1,700 fans attended the show. This is the show where Jerry Lawler became a double champion. He won the World Class Championship Wrestling World title and the AWA World title, but he didn't get paid. So Jarrett and Gagne have a beef following this show because, Jerry Jarrett doesn't trust Vern Gagne anymore because Vern Gagne would not pay the talent. So later in 1989, after they disparaged Jerry Lawler on television, calling him a coward and all kind of other stuff because he refused to defend the AWA World title, they ended up stripping him of the belt. And in 1989, Larry Zbyszko, who was the son-in-law of Vern Gagne, becomes the world champion. And of course, that didn't do him any good. And they went bankrupt in 1991. So there was an interesting thing here. Another interesting little piece here is that the WWF heard about Super Clash 2. And despite the fact that they weren't really that concerned about it because of all of the shenanigans with the big heads involved, like Vern and Jarrett and all these guys, Fritz, who I think it was Fritz wasn't around at this time. So you had this situation that Vince found out about Kerry's foot. At this point, Kerry Von Erich's foot had been amputated. So the WWF called the Illinois State Athletic Commission trying to get that match canceled because Kerry Von Erich only has one foot. Of course, it didn't work, but that's one of the many dirty tactics that Vince pulled when he was in real competition with real promoters. And he saw that they were ganging up on him. He tried to kill their main event. Like, it's the craziest thing. It's so wild. Then he hired Kerry after this. So he didn't care about the guy not having a foot. He didn't care. He just didn't want them to have a main event. It wouldn't have done him any good anyway because only 1,700 people showed up. But the rise and fall of the AWA is incredible. It is wild. The AWA was a very solid promotion for 20 some odd years. But they just got stuck in their ways. They refused to actually pay talent. They expanded quite a bit. They were successful enough to expand to some places, and they was able to run and be the only game in town in some of those markets. But in other markets, they faced fierce competition, like in LA, because McMahon's came out there right after they got to LA. The Vince came out there, so it was a very interesting thing. World Class Championship Wrestling was founded in Dallas. And Ed McLemore, one of the original owners of what would become the World Class Wrestling promotion, was a member of the NWA at the beginning. The man who will become most known for being the owner of WCCW or World Class would be Fritz Von Erich, who took over as president of the NWA in 1975. It was a temporary thing, though. So the Von Erichs, of course, was a wildly successful wrestling promotion, and they became so popular, of course, that their shows started to bleed into other NWA territories. This led to a war with Joe Blanchard. Joe Blanchard, the father of Tully Blanchard, ran the Southwest Championship Wrestling promotion in San Antonio, and in a strange, very strange decision, the NWA actually aided Blanchard in this situation. So the NWA kind of turned their back on World Class, mainly because their shows were now starting to pop up in other people's territories, as if they could control that. In any event, the NWA started to aid Blanchard, and it really soured their relationship with the Von Erichs. The Von Erichs, of course, had a long relationship with Paul Bosch in Houston. And they also had a pretty good thing going on with Antonio Inoki in Japan, where they were getting paid $200,000 to supply him with American talent. And they had such a really strong hold in Dallas that the WWF really couldn't get in there. But it was a very difficult thing because in the mid 80s, the Von Erichs got into a lot of trouble. It began in 1983 when Kerry Von Erich was arrested for drug possession. In 1984, February 10th, 1984, David Von Erich died of acute intentitis. In 1985, Mike Von Erich got sick in Israel after an injury. Gino Hernandez died in 1986. He died of a drug overdose. Also in 1986, Kerry Von Erich was out for months. He was the top draw. He was out for months in 1986 with a broken ankle from a motorcycle accident. He would have that foot amputated in 1987. Also in 1987, Mike Von Erich, suffering from depression from his illness and being pretty much rushed back to wrestling, he decided to commit suicide. So it was a very difficult 4 years of world-class championship wrestling. And this is, of course, going on while they're being double-crossed by the NWA. So with the NWA double-crossing them, they decided to go independent. In 1986, they dumped the NWA World Championship and created their own world title. And the World Class Championship Wrestling World Championship, I believe the first champion was Rick Rude. And they had spent years building up the NWA title as being the most important championship in pro wrestling. But now they have to turn almost on a dime at the beginning of 1986 and decide that, hey, you know, the NWA ain't so great. We're better than that. But they were, you know, one of the more popular promotions in the NWA. They had some of the most popular stars, and it's a huge territory, that Dallas area. But it was just too much. His sons were dying and being injured, so Fritz decided he was going to get out of the business. So in 1987, Fritz sold his shares of World Class Championship Wrestling to Kerry and Kevin and Ken Mantell. Ken Mantell was a longtime booker of World Class Championship Wrestling. It wouldn't last long, though. The company would fall deeply into debt, $100,000 into debt in 1988 money. It's not really working out. 2 years after, Kerry loses his foot, things has been very difficult for the Von Erichs. Ken Mantell was, their booker. Now he's gone. They turn for help. They go to Jerry Jarrett, and they sell him 60% of World Class and kept 40% for Kerry and Kevin. This led to the complete dissolving of World Class Championship Wrestling into the USWA, which was the merging of Memphis and WCCW, to which the Von Erichs owned a very small percentage of it around that time. So the world class, was betrayed by the NWA, and it was basically because of their own popularity. They had gotten so popular that their show had even crossed the ocean. They were doing shows in Israel because their show had popped up in Israel. The Von Erichs are Jews also. So it was a very difficult thing for them, because once they ended up winning the war with Joe Blanchard, of course, but they spent so much money in doing so. And then, of course, Vince started coming down to Dallas, and it became like they were just fighting on all fronts. And you started to bleed money, and then your stars are dying or getting severely injured. There's like a huge issue going on down there. So this was really fascinating stuff, to learn about the way that the NWA chose a promoter who was not even a member. I don't believe Joe Blanchard was even a member of the NWA when they were helping him fight off the Von Erichs, because the Von Erichs had a show, that was, again, going in different markets, and it just happened to hit San Antonio. So it's really, really weird. And it was fascinating stuff to read. St. Louis is another story that I feel like really is probably so underrated as far as the wrestling wars is concerned, because it was considered the heart of the NWA. And the reason it was considered the heart of the NWA is because Sam Mushnick, the longtime promoter of St. Louis, was the president of the NWA for a long, long time. And so when things started to go wrong in St. Louis, it got real bad throughout the NWA. So as I've said, Sam Mushnick was the longtime promoter of the St. Louis Wrestling Club in St. Louis, Missouri. He had a popular show called Wrestling at the Chase, and things were going swimmingly up until 1982, where Sam Mushnick just plain got old. And so he decided to retire. He turned his promotion over to Bob Geigel, who was the Kansas City promoter. Well, the Kansas City promotion was called Central States. And Pat O'Connor was a partner of that, and so was Vern Gagne. So Bob Geigel, Pat O'Connor, Vern Gagne, and Harley Race all ended up being co-promoters of St. Louis and Kansas City. So with Bob Geigel being the head of both promotions, Kansas City and St. Louis were essentially merged into one market. Now, this, of course, did not sit well with St. Louis loyalists like Larry Matysik. Larry Matysik was the former assistant to Sam Mushnick and, a St. Louis loyalist. He was a traditional guy who thought that there was a certain style to St. Louis wrestling and that it should be preserved. And that Bob Geigel's style of wrestling did not fit St. Louis. So he didn't want to help Bob Geigel. So he left Bob Geigel's St. Louis Wrestling Club due to creative differences and decided to start his own promotion, the Greater St. Louis Wrestling Enterprises, in 1983. This means he had to run opposition to the NWA in St. Louis. This is a fascinating story. So Bob Geigel found out that Vince McMahon was actually helping Larry Matysik. So the WWF invades the Chase Hotel in 1983 with Hulk Hogan. Vince is in regular conversation with Larry Matysik, and Bob Geigel is losing TV markets to the WWF. Matysik thinks that the WWF is on his side. He thinks that Vince is trying to help him fight off Bob Geigel. Vince has his own agenda in St. Louis. So Bob Geigel criticized Vince McMahon for overpaying for TV time, saying that it would kill his market. And it did. Harley Race once complained in 1986 that he lost $500,000 promoting in St. Louis and Kansas City. He just absolutely could not deal with it anymore. He got the hell out of there. The story of Harley Race losing $500,000 is Bob Geigel's fault, but it's also Vince McMahon's fault. So to help Bob Geigel fend off the WWF, at the time, WCCW was still part of the NWA. And the Von Erichs came to St. Louis to help Bob Geigel battle against Vince McMahon. So Vince McMahon, being smart, he decided he was going to get the Von Erichs out of this conversation. So how did he do that? He did that by sending Andre the Giant to Dallas. He says, hey, I'll give you guys Andre the Giant, but you can't send any more Von Erichs to Kansas City, St. Louis. Can't send them to the Central States area no more. No more. They agreed, and they abandoned Bob Geigel, and it's so bad. It's so bad. And during this time, Vince McMahon decided to go for the kill. He decides to get the Kiel Auditorium, which is the main building for Bob Geigel's promotion, and get them to sign an exclusive WWF deal. This was in 1985. This, of course, was the absolute death blow to the St. Louis wrestling territory. Larry Matysik had already gone out of business. He was already done. Bob Geigel is now finished. Harley Race lost a ton of money. Bob Geigel ends up selling his shares to Jim Crockett Promotions in 1986, and St. Louis was essentially done. And it became a Jim Crockett Promotions territory from that point forward. This is a very important victory for Vince, because St. Louis was not just, because of, hey, St. Louis was the heart of the NWA, but also Bob Geigel, I believe, was the NWA president at the time. I didn't take notes on that. I'm guessing that he was the NWA president at the time. And that the NWA had over 25 members. That's 25 different cities and states around this time that Bob Geigel was, or the NWA was at its strength. By the time Bob Geigel gave up on the NWA and quit, there was less than 10 members. NWA went from being serviced in 25 states and across nations. It had 5 different countries. The United States, it was Japan, there was Korea, there was Mexico, there was Canada. There were NWA members everywhere. By the time Bob Geigel gave up, there was less than 10. And the reason why is because Vince bought out some guys. I think he bought into Toronto. He bought Stu Hart. He bought some other guys. So most of the other ones just got old and they quit and they gave out and they sold out to Vince, or they sold out to Jim Crockett. but it was a history of backstabbing and politics and all this ugly, ugly business. Like the Detroit territory, which I found to be very fascinating, was run by Ed Farhat, the uncle of Sabu, the original Sheik, and he had gotten stabbed in the back by the NWA. They had run opposition in Detroit, and so he decided he was going to help the opposition, I believe, in Georgia, and they ended up suspending him, and he ended up losing control of his promotion. Like, it was insane stuff that was going on, and you can to read it and to be able to understand that history is absolutely beautiful stuff. It's a really good book. This isn't just a good history book. It's also a great cautionary tale. It tells the story of all of these guys who was able to work together as long as the technology allowed them to maintain their barriers, and also that nobody became too successful. Because every time that somebody became too successful, they overstepped their boundaries. Every single time. Whenever somebody started to become a success, their company started to grow. And then the moment the company started to grow, they were elbowing somebody else's territory. And the technology was starting to grow as well, because now, local TV is one thing, but now cable is on the horizon in the late 80s. And it's different because you can't control what markets those shows go into once, cable is now a thing. So it became very important for Jim Crockett Promotions to have TBS. It became very important for the WWF to have USA Network. And most of these other promotions couldn't get, national TV. They couldn't get on cable. But they also barely had local TV because Vince was coming in and booting them off their local TV products. And so that was, a really good thing to learn. And also you see the shark pit, the politics of guys not liking each other and wanting to put each other out of business. Guys who it was like, I think Jim Barnett was one of these guys who, was helping the WWF put some of his guys he had long-term feuds with. Like, he helped Vince get the Georgia Championship Wrestling, the Black Saturday. He helped Vince with that because he used to run Georgia and he had some problems with the NWA and he wanted to, take it out on them. So there was like a personal beef involved with that. There was a lot of stuff in this book that you can learn about pro wrestling. And there's a lot of it you can learn about life and you can learn about success. And the NWA being the type of organization where everybody is supposed to have their own little piece. And then people started to get old. And then technology got better. And then people started to get a little bit more obtuse. And then Vince showed up. There was like a lot of different things that if you read this book, you'll understand why the territories died and why it was inevitable, to be quite honest. It wasn't if Vince hadn't put the territories out of business, no, they were going to die anyway. Because a lot of the old promoters were getting old and selling their promotions to people who didn't know what they were doing. Business was trending down anyway. Or they might have hit some sort of financial iceberg. For instance, Bill Watts in Mid-South Wrestling, the oil industry takes a dive. So now people are losing their jobs. He can't, some of his stocks and different things like that are having trouble. The Junkyard Dog had gotten bought out by the WWE, so he's gone. Houses are starting to trail off. That sort of stuff starts to happen. You start seeing how the local economies, the TV networks, personalities, business arrangements, personal beefs, how all of this stuff factors into the territories dying, and it was inevitable. That's the big picture here. Vince did hasten some of this stuff, but with some of his shark tactics, but it was inevitable for a lot of these territories that they were going to end up going, and it's very interesting. I highly, highly suggest that you read this book.